Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Overcoming the Podcast. I am your host, Taylor. And today we are going to be talking about a long awaited topic about how changes and transitions and role shifts in life can impact you functionally. And specifically, we're going to zone in on ADHD as part of this ADHD mini series, but it also can apply to pretty much anyone because we all have life changes and transitions. That's just part of life. But today I am joined with Amy. Amy is a therapist and she calls herself a neurospicy therapist, which just makes my heart so happy. Keeping the joy alive. And she is here to share a little bit more about her story and help bring some more introduction to this topic from professional lens, but also personal lens, which we all know is how I love to do things. So I'm going to send it over to Amy to introduce herself and she can share a little bit of her story and why she's so passionate about this topic. So, Amy, take it away for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I love owning my neuro spiciness for sure. And, I'm finding that my story is actually a lot more common than I thought as I'm talking to more people and more women that were late diagnosed. And so, throughout my whole life, I struggled with anxiety, low self-esteem, depression, and, went on different medications, was in different types of therapy, and nothing quite worked the way that I had hoped. I just kind of white knuckled it, and found certain coping mechanisms like people pleasing and perfectionism and high achieving to kind of get me through it. And, I always had these traits that I was questioning, like, why are things so much harder for me? Why these like basic things, where everyone else can do them, I really struggle with. And I thought it just was some type of like flaw or personality issue. I just never felt like a real adult. Um, so, on kind of this journey, I became a mom and I now have two girls. And when motherhood hit me, all of a sudden my symptoms really changed and everything became really amplified. So my anxiety and my like emotional regulation became really hard to manage. I became overwhelmed and overstimulated all the time. And so my previous coping mechanisms no longer worked in the same way. And that's when I really started to figure out something else was going on here. And kind of at the same time in my own practice as a therapist and coach, I was seeing kind of this similar story with a lot of these women and moms coming to me saying, motherhood has made me crazy. Like, I don't know what's
Yeah.
going on, but I'm losing my mind. I can't control my emotions. I have this severe brain fog. I can't remember anything. I feel like a nutcase. What
Mm.
is going on? And we were, approaching it from like a postpartum anxiety approach or treatment, looking at postpartum depression. Maybe you're just like overwhelmed, you're sleep deprived, but
Yeah.
that wasn't it. There was like another piece to this puzzle. And so I went through my own kind of diagnosis process. And at age 39, sure enough, ADHD. And it was such a bittersweet experience for me because I felt like, in a sense, my whole world, my whole life made so much sense kind of looking through that lens of
Hmm.
ADHD and how women experience it and how differently it presents in girls and females. And just kind of this like gender bias that so many healthcare professionals have, and even like the DSM, our diagnostic criteria,
Oh,
has, which causes so many young girls to get lost in this process and fly under the radar and kind of misdiagnosed. And the sad part about all of this, as I'm learning just in my own experience, but also seeing this professionally, is the devastation when girls get missed and they don't get diagnosed, living a majority of their life not knowing what's going on with them. It
hmm.
severe low self-esteem and low self-worth, severe anxiety,
Yeah.
depression, body dysmorphia, disordered eating, issues with relationships, issues in career and independent living. So it just is, impacting every area of functioning. So after getting my own diagnosis and learning this about myself, I just became so passionate about kind of spreading this awareness and this word to other people. And now even taking that back to my own practice and having to like relearn about ADHD as a therapist and what to look out for and what to screen for, and really being able to save a lot of women, to say, well, I think this might be going on, and helping them kind of get the right diagnosis and the right treatment, and to see that like life change in these other women and also myself has made this like my calling.
I love that so much. You can definitely see how passionate you are about it, which is part of the reason I was like, let's talk about this. The moment you mentioned just the whole conversation, because I was like, I think that one, this is super needed. And two, your just passion shines through. So thank you, one, for being the human you are. And two, for bringing this important message to us, because I do think that it is missed. And I relate to so many things that you said, and I'm sure that many of our listeners do as well, especially of not knowing what was going on your whole life and then internalizing that it was you. I was diagnosed at 29, right before my 30th birthday. And I guarantee that if it wasn't like for me becoming an entrepreneur, that I wouldn't have even thought that was it. Where I'd worked through all of my trauma and a lot of the things were like, I didn't really have any PTSD symptoms anymore. And it wasn't even like meeting the clinical diagnosis for anxiety, but I was still having issues with other things. And so the things that I kept ruling out and ruling out, there was more there. Like you said, there's another piece.
Yeah.
And so it led me to that. And ADHD TikTok helped with that because a lot of girls and women normalizing that this also can be ADHD and recognizing that me as an occupational therapist in school, we talked about ADHD, but we talked about the stereotypical little boy who's jumping off the walls, who's destructive, and who can't focus, right? Hyperverbal, all of that stuff. And I was the opposite. I was the daydreamer. I was the one. I had a primary, like I have a combined type ADHD. So like socially, I was very hyperactive, and like that's where my emotional regulation struggled. But also I was the one who, when it came down to like focusing on tasks, I was just the daydreamer head in the clouds. And then
Mm.
later I'm grateful that I was intelligent enough that I like pretty much taught myself the stuff that we were going over in class to catch up, because I wasn't the one who was paying attention at all. I was just kind of like, ooh, okay. Doing homework really fast. I would either have to like do homework in the classroom right as we had that last 5 minutes, do the entire thing, or I just would never do it, right? Because like starting executive functioning at home, that certainly wasn't going to happen. And I grew up in a dysfunctional family environment. So there's no way that anything getting done at home is productive. And so, yeah, I think that it's just really interesting, like looking back, how much we can really see. But like you said, also how different roles show up and kind of bring this awareness. So let's kind of chime in a little bit on your story for what you said about being a mom. So, looking back specifically at your life, what have you found as far as the examples that you noticed within motherhood? Or do you have any stories that you can share with us that might stick out and maybe others might identify with?
Absolutely. And I think just early on in like my postpartum experience, recognizing that I was super sensitive to like sleep deprivation, kind of the overload and overwhelm of motherhood, and trying to take care of someone else outside myself just became a lot. The emotional regulation piece, where now I'm not just having to regulate my own emotions, but I'm having to co-regulate with two tiny humans. So, just like this chronic overwhelm that I was feeling with like this mental load of motherhood. And that's what I'm seeing overall with ADHD. Anytime there's a life transition where you have an increase of responsibility or obligation, where your brain now has to be responsible for more things, to think about more things, to execute more things, can become really overwhelming. I no longer had time for myself in the way that I was used to kind of regulate,
Yeah.
right? And take a breath and just kind of recharge. And the overstimulation was huge too, because now I don't have control over my environment,
Yeah.
right? Like I can't keep the house clean and tidy and organized in the way that I was used to, because I have these two little human beings now that are interfering with that. Like the noise pollution, is something that was huge. I just wasn't like used to all these different noises and things that were out of my control and unpredictable, whether it's a baby crying or a toddler having a meltdown, is a television on in the background. And so just all these things started to become too much to manage. And even as my children get older and more verbal and emotional, now they're expressing their big emotions in a very big way. And I can see like I'm really struggling to kind of manage myself in those situations. So those were all kind of some signs and symptoms that something wasn't quite right, because before kids, like I said, I kind of found my groove. I found my way to cope and regulate, but then all of a sudden everything changed. I could no longer have the same self-care routine. I could no longer control my environment. My brain was overloaded now with all this responsibility and mental load. And I think that's when my brain just kind of shut down and said, okay, we've been hanging on for 39 years, but like, this is too much. And it just became a lot. And that's what I'm seeing with a lot of these moms that are coming to me. And I do specialize in like perinatal care and postpartum. And so many of these women are being diagnosed with like postpartum anxiety or depression, and they're not responding to treatment. And they're reporting the overstimulation, the overwhelm, the emotional dysregulation. And anytime I start to hear that, I really start to screen more for the ADHD, because a lot of providers don't know to look for that, right? If you haven't been diagnosed as a kid, how could you have it now? But now we know the average age for women to be diagnosed is in their 30s and 40s. However, the average age for boys, 6 to 8, right? So that type of discrepancy to me is still mind blowing, and there's still a lot of work to be done with that. But motherhood and postpartum is a huge life transition that we see a lot of women now getting diagnosed.
I think the main thing when it comes to any life transition is the lack of control sometimes, right? Especially when there's like a life shift happens, someone gets sick, or you need to get a change of job, or you have to move, or whatever it is. It's like that sense of control and that sense of normalcy and that routine that you once had that worked really well, it's not the same anymore. And so you have to be able to problem solve and adapt. And yes, in some situations you may be able to learn how to adapt. And I guarantee, like, as a mom, you figure that out. And we can talk about that in a little bit as well. But just recognizing that it's going to take time. And especially if there are other things going on that are undiagnosed, like if you've experienced trauma and there's all of these things that are being triggered, right? Trauma is another one of those things that can be re-triggered in motherhood because of, like, hey, I'm now in this role where I was when trauma happened and from my caregiver, and now this is extra hard, or now this is the generational pattern, or whatever it may be, right? And like you said, like sleep deprivation and all of these factors into it. So just like, it just makes so much sense to me. And I hear the same thing, just like from other humans in general, that motherhood has just completely changed them. That's one of the things as well that they talk about in like the occupational therapy, online social media space, that motherhood really, there's just so much of a role shift, and also like cognitively how much that can take. And people don't realize that when it comes to being a parent, there's just so much more that you have to manage. It's enough to manage yourself and your life. And if you don't get to something, then it's like, well, okay, that's just me that I'm responsible for. But when you're responsible for the entire family and making sure that they all go to the different activities and have all of these million things going in your head and taking care of the house and being all of these roles, which, they say, like, especially like in being a stay-at-home mom, that there's just so many things that go into that, also like social deprivation and so much, right? And I think I saw a video on that saying that it was somewhere of like upwards of a few $100,000 that a stay-at-home mom, like, they would need to hire professionals for to cover everything that they do. Like, it's like 10 jobs. It's like 10, 15 jobs. Just think about your brain trying to manage that many jobs at once. That's a lot. And that makes so much sense. And then of course, if you have ADHD on top of that, diagnosed or undiagnosed, it's still really challenging. So that makes a whole lot of sense. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. And I hope that by people understanding and hearing this, and even like therapists who are listening, maybe get them to be a little bit more curious when it comes to screening for things like ADHD, and referring out if necessary, but just recognizing that this is not always just anxiety or depression. There's other types of things. For those who don't know a little bit about ADHD and like the self-regulation component, can you share a little bit about some of the common things that are missed? Because people, when they hear ADHD, they're like, oh, it's just attention. If you can pay attention, then it's not ADHD. Can you explain a little bit about that for people who may not be as familiar?
Absolutely. And I think that is such a common misperception. People don't associate emotional dysregulation with ADHD. People hear ADHD and they think someone's just kind of spacey, they don't focus, they're forgetful, or they're hyperactive, right? And even myself as a clinician, I've been in the field for 17 years, and like early on, my first job was actually at like an ADHD clinic, like assessing young children, school age children. Like, we weren't really taught about that. We weren't taught about all these different elements of executive functioning, right? We were just kind of taught about like focus, hyperactivity, this is what you screen for. And now I'm learning that ADHD impacts every area of functioning, because it's all our executive functioning. And that is a huge part of emotional regulation, being able to control our emotional response. and self-regulate, and being able to have the capacity to kind of pause and process what's happening and then regulate our emotional response based on that. And that is really, really hard when you have ADHD, especially if you don't have the right coping mechanisms. So to me, that's like a huge sign that I look for when people say, I just can't regulate my emotions. These women that say, like, I'm going into work and I'm like crying all the time, or I'm like lashing out and having this like rage and this anger all of a sudden. I don't know where it's coming from. Like, as much as I try, I just can't contain or control my emotions. They're just kind of pouring out of me. And now we're learning this is part of executive functioning, right? So all of this is impaired in our brain, and we have to find ways to manage that. So yeah, that was a huge indicator for me with my own children. When I'm like, why am I losing control? Like, why is this so triggering for me? Where I'm like yelling and like I'm turning into this like rageful person that I've never been before. It's because it just was too much input coming at me, and I couldn't regulate myself.
Yep. And sometimes even, I work with kids, and sometimes I experience very similar where it's just like a lot of sounds and a lot of things happening. And it's just like, you can feel very overwhelmed very quickly. And like you said, kids are going to be kids. They, like, you can't control how loud they are, what they're, I mean, you can try and coach and things like that. Yeah. But at the end of the day, like, you can't force a child to do anything, right? Like, it's outside of your control. And obviously there are strategies and things of that nature. But what I'm saying is just like, is just another human being. There are
Mm-hmm.
other little humans who are just trying to learn and develop and grow. And here's the thing: is if you're neurodivergent, then there can be a genetic component to that, and then they may also be struggling with that. And so, and it's just like their brains are overwhelmed and their brains are overloaded, and all of those things that just add into that it can be really hard to manage. And the self-regulation component is really huge. I completely agree. And I do think that is one that is missed in so many things. And I think that self-regulation is the foundational skill for life, period.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless of ADHD, regardless of anything else, self-regulation is what we need to be able to be functioning human beings in society. That's just what it is.
Absolutely. And I always say a dysregulated adult cannot regulate a dysregulated child,
No.
right? And that's kind of what goes wrong, like you said. So if you're dysregulated, your children are dysregulated, you're just kind of like bouncing off of each other, and things just continue to escalate.
Yeah, and then what? It's just not a fun situation for anyone, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about is some of the people in the ADHD space, how a lot of us have been entrepreneurs,
Mm-hmm.
and recognizing some of these things that have popped up in these types of roles, which different but similar in that there are many different hats that you have to wear. There are a lot of different things that are happening at once, especially in beginning stages of a business, and maybe also not recognizing how much until you get into it. Even if you're prepared, you don't realize like you have to be the social media curator and you have to be the lawyer and you have to be all of these things at the beginning. And so being able to balance that and still have their own life and be able to build and be able to focus and be able to create and all of these things, whatever they're doing, there's just so many pieces to the puzzle with that. And so for me, that's kind of how mine came about, is that I recognized that I was unable to do the things that I was so passionate about and I wanted to do. And when it came to sitting down at the computer, I was done. Like, I could sit there and I could talk about things all day, but the moment that I had to sit down on the computer and create, or like these courses or whatever it may be, or sit down and do notes or anything, my brain just basically felt like it just like turned off. And there were some days where I woke up where there were so many things in my brain I couldn't get it to turn on. It's called like the days the brain doesn't want a brain.
Yep.
And so then recognizing it's just like, I'm so lazy. I want to do, why can't I do this? Right. Internalizing so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognized that a bunch of people in the ADHD creator space either recognized more challenges or kind of that's what woke them up, was stepping into something that was new in a career endeavor or doing something on their own. And one of the things that I kind of recognized from that is how much people who are neurodivergent and ADHD specifically crave structure, but also hate it, also
Mm-hmm.
need it, but not too much, and need flexibility and that balance of all the things. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, like, combination of structure and flexibility and like control and things being out of control or just kind of being able to kind of go with the flow. Because I think that's another thing that kind of leads into these challenges and functional impacts when we have any kind of changes, And especially if you're someone who is a mother or, trying to manage all of these things, or you're an entrepreneur, or you're just trying to refigure your life out and restructure when you're in the middle of a healing journey, because that's a full-time job in itself too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, looking at the idea of structure versus flexibility, do you have any advice for anyone who's dealing with these life changes and may have ADHD or struggle with managing all the things, of like what to kind of get started with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, often ADHD, we see a lot of these paradox, right? Like you said, we crave novelty and adventure and new and exciting things. And we want to be like flexible and spontaneous. But at the same time, we also need kind of that structure to ground us and keep us accountable. And so I think that's why we see so many ADHDers in this space of being creators or entrepreneurs, because we're very innovative, we're very creative, we're great at coming up with these ideas and providing a service. We're very passionate because often we get bored in kind of a traditional job or corporate setting, right? So we kind of seek out this type of work. However, like you said, we soon learn that, oh gosh, there's a lot more than just like providing this service. And I felt that too. I mean, I was so excited to open my private practice and provide therapy and coaching. And I 100% love every minute of providing a service when a client is in front of me. However, all the administrative stuff, right? Billing, notes, paperwork, marketing, there's just so many elements that I wasn't aware of that now I'm responsible for. And my brain doesn't like that. My brain likes the client contact and that work. But like you said, when I get off that call and I have to do a note and bill and do case management, my brain's like, nope, this doesn't give me dopamine. I don't want this. And there's no one else to hold me accountable. Right. So as ADHDers, we thrive off that external pressure. And I think that's why I did so well in school, right? Like I was a very high achiever because I had so much anxiety about disappointing someone, messing up, failing, that my anxiety compensated for my ADHD. And if you think about it, like why would you think to pull someone that is a 4.0 student with no behavioral issues, a good girl, and test her for ADHD, right? Like now it makes sense. But now I can see that I was masking hardcore with all the other stuff. So yeah, being an entrepreneur can be an eye opener because there are certain things that we really do struggle with, but we also have all these great strengths, with our ADHD brain, and just kind of learning to optimize that. So focusing on the strengths and things that we're really good at and finding systems in place to help with the things that we struggle with. And maybe that means bringing on an assistant or other people on our team to kind of help execute things, getting a mentor or coach to hold us accountable, right? Finding ways to address our working memory issues and time blindness and prioritizing tasks. I love, something simple like this, a little to-do list for the day. I have my planner, I have sticky notes everywhere. So really kind of creating systems in place like that. And it's not one size fits all. So you have to sometimes just experiment to see, how you can organize your day, but don't be afraid to ask for help or support so that you can be successful. So I totally can relate to being an entrepreneur and business owner and trying to balance that with the ADHD.
And, I think the thing that you just shared about the planner is actually perfect, because if people are not watching the video, she just like held up this planner that has these like colored boxes on it. And one thing that I have realized, especially, is that with executive dysfunction, whether it comes from ADHD or another source, is that getting things out of your head and into your physical environment in front of you is one of the best things that you can do. So anything that is super visual and like compartmentalizing, categorizing, like I was the color coder, that's how I got through school. Very much
Oh
like
yeah.
everything you said about the school thing, that was entirely me. Just tap on to that I added that as my identity, and that was me in school, right?
Oh
And so it makes a lot of sense. And so when we're looking at how to manage all of this stuff, when we don't have people as much accountable, and we aren't like in this like fear mindset of perform or masking or whatever, and especially in adults when we're learning how to unmask, when it feels like sometimes there can be like a skill regression because we learned things at a certain point with this high level of anxiety. So when we're more regulated, or when we're not under that pressure anymore, it's really hard to perform. It's
Mm-hmm.
really being able to say, okay, well, now how do I help my brain do what it needs to do? Because we can't use that anymore to fuel us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a huge part of where mine came from too, is that those things worked for a while. Those coping mechanisms were great, but eventually it leads to burnout. It
Yeah.
eventually just leads to just like you can't do anything, right? So recognizing what that is, and I think going back to like the structure and flexibility piece, especially in work, there are many times where I think it's like finding the right setting for you and finding the right fit, whether it's entrepreneur or whatever else. So as an occupational therapist, I started off in a clinic that was outpatient and it was just in one place. And I worked in pediatrics, and they would come in, and I was there 4 to 5 times a week. It was usually like 4 long days and a half day for the fifth, and that was my administration day. And I requested that because I knew that I needed it separate to be able to like get lengthy reports done and things like that. I also had deadlines I had to meet by insurance and all of these things. So there was a lot of pressure on me to be able to do certain things. And still I struggled and was pushing some deadlines more than I needed to be because it was challenging. However, very similar to you, did really great with like the clinical stuff and like in person, seeing clients, connecting in person, sit down and do paperwork, and it's just that much harder.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are other settings, like in that setting, I actually did quite well as far as managing that because there was one location. Everything was set up in place for me. There was like a break room set up where everyone kind of just had like desks. It was like a big table of like all of the desks around the outside of the room, and everyone did their notes together but separate often. So like lunch breaks would be sitting there, whatever. And so sometimes I'd be talking, but it was also the kind of alone together body doubling all the time, which I didn't even know what that was at the time because it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
diagnosed. But that kind of environment really helped me to be able to do things. And then I got laid off in that job in the middle of the pandemic, and then I ended up getting picked up by a different job. But it was 3 different settings. And I was at a clinic 1 day a week, which was similar to the other one that I was at before. But then I was like traveling to different schools, and some were virtual, some were going back and forth between virtual and in person. And then afterwards, I would go to see different homes, and going from home to home is like a new work environment every time.
Yeah.
And so then having to figure out how I managed my paperwork and did all of these things and responsible for all these things and shifting all the time, I had a really, really hard time. And so I loved the flexibility of the idea of like those 3 different and like the variability, right, of the 3 different settings. And they even were like, oh, you get to make your own schedule to a degree, and like you're the one who can be in charge of this and whatever. That sounds great. So much autonomy, so much freedom. But the problem was is that I didn't have enough structure within that and enough kind of routine to be
Mm-hmm.
able to keep things afloat. So I would go home, take all of this stuff home, and just be overwhelmed. And so I got to that point in that job where it's not that I was even just pushing deadlines. There are sometimes like month, 2 months out where I hadn't gotten a client their evaluation paperwork. And anyone in home health or anything knows that is really not good. Really
Yeah.
not good. And because I just could not get my brain to turn on and organize and do all the things, and I was starting to get in trouble at work and be like, what's going on top of the stress of the pandemic? Like there were other factors, but I didn't have enough structure. Even though I despised sometimes the structure and the forced routine that I had at that other place, I realized it was actually really good for me,
Mm-hmm.
and helped me to be able to perform and function. So when I became an entrepreneur, at first I was just like, I'm just going to be free as a bird, and I'm going to figure things out and just not have a schedule and not have anything. And you can imagine how that went very similarly, right? Now
Mm-hmm.
I have some kind of a structure. I work part time. I prioritize flexibility in some ways, but structure and routine in other ways. And I find that it's just a little bit more helpful. But, I work 2 to 3 times a week, part time, where I have to go somewhere. And then I come back, and then I'm able to either figure out on, say, because I work Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So Mondays and Fridays are really these days that are structured for this, and I have to get this done. Sundays, I'm making sure things are set up for social media, and that's the day that I do all those things, right? And obviously, we recognize it with ADHD. We have to be flexible to some degree because sometimes we have these lower energy days, or our brain just doesn't do as much, or we have to adapt somehow. And it can be helpful to have some flexibility, but I have found a danger in having too much, and that
Yeah.
your brain just stops. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes there's this quote that's kind of sticking out to me. It's like life tests you in 2 main ways. Either nothing is happening at all, or everything is happening all at once.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just like sums up executive dysfunction.
For sure.
Have
Mm-hmm.
you ever had those periods in your life that were calmer, or just like there wasn't much happening where it was kind of challenging to figure out how to navigate it all?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I was kind of in my groove, it's when things were like stabilized and normal. Like I was used to my life and my routine and nothing major was changing. And then when there would be a change, suddenly that was like a wrench thrown at me. And I'm like, okay, now I have to adjust. I have to figure out this new way of coping and living and managing my symptoms. I didn't know that I was doing that, but I definitely can look back now and kind of see, like, during puberty, my adolescent years, when I went off to college and was forced into kind of independent living, when I first got married and had to share a living space with someone else, then having children, so kind of seeing all these major life transitions and how that brought out my symptoms. And at those points, I just thought I was more anxious. But now I can see that it really was my brain saying, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? And then when I started my business, for sure, really trying to figure out that whole thing and find a healthy balance for myself. And I think that's key. Like you said, it's finding that balance, right? Where you have structure, but you also have that flexibility. And for me, I'm the same way. Like, I have to designate time to do things. And what happened to me during COVID was, there were so many people that wanted help, that needed like mental health support. I just took on way too many people. So, I was seeing 35 or 40 people a week, and that's just client contact, right? So there's another like 20, 25 hours of admin work that goes with that. And I wasn't scheduling time for that. I was like, I'm just going to fill up my schedule, see all these people. And then I didn't think about, well, when's that other stuff going to happen? Oh, I'll just do it between sessions. No, because mentally, like, I have to like separate things out. Okay, this is like my session mode. This is my like notes mode, my billing mode, my social media mode. So that's one thing that's really helped me is like time blocking. So I might have certain days or like points in the day where, like, okay, I'm doing social media content. I'm doing my billing and notes. Okay, this is like my client time, because my brain needs that separation to really function appropriately. I can't just go from one task to another. Like, I need time to decompress and transition.
I also, just while you were talking about the separation as well, I think sometimes thinking about socially, I wonder
Mm-hmm.
if you experience this as well. When there aren't as many rules or boundaries, or like when relationships are ambiguous, or those work relationships that feel like a family, I look back to like I had a lot of challenge functioning in those spaces, and I really wonder if it's like I couldn't like compartmentalize, like, this is work brain, this is personal brain, right? So like sometimes in work brain where they're like, oh, well, I would overshare in places it's really not okay for work, even if we're cool and whatever, and then I'd get in trouble, right? And just recognizing that, like, sometimes when those boundaries aren't very clear and established, I think it can be really hard for people who have ADHD. And it's not just the things about the role shift or like all of the cognitive things. Sometimes there is social component, sometimes there is emotional component, right? Think about like dating.
Oh
I just think
yeah.
about, like that kind of role shift, and like, okay, so how do I navigate this? And, what do I share here? And what do I do here? And there's like all of this like internal monologue with this of like, how do I be able to do this in a safe way? What am I looking out for that's possibly unsafe in them? How am I making sure that I'm showing up as my full self? How am I making sure that I'm balancing all the things, right? And one of the things that my therapist told me a while ago was that you can think of any kind of change in life as taking up more capacity. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just, it takes up space, and you may not realize how much space it's taking up because maybe it feels more simple, or it's happy or enjoyable, but it's still taking up space in your brain because your brain isn't in that kind of routine habitual pattern yet, right? It's something that's new, it's something that you're having to adapt to. So you only have so much more space left to give when you're going through a change. So then when you're going through multiple changes at once, that's a whole lot more that's filled until you have less capacity at baseline from that within being in change to manage. So then those regulation skills are that much more important, or being able to find time for the coping skills, or that me time or whatever is that much more important. But when we're having multiple changes happening at once, it's the last thing we're thinking about. And like you said, like, you didn't have the me time anymore as a mom, you didn't have the ability to just cope in the same way that you did because things changed, and your capacity, I'm sure, within that is lessened. Um, so, for people who are going through changes, do you have any advice about being able to work with either a smaller capacity, or how to like maximize your capacity while you're going through just change in general?
Yes, I think that's so important to talk about. And our brain wants things to stay the same. Our brain craves like the status quo, right? Because it doesn't have to work as hard. It's like, okay, everything's cool. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. We're good. And that's why in therapy and coaching, I see a lot of this like internal resistance when people are coming in trying to change their cognitive process and their mindset and they're trying to change their behaviors. Like they want to make these changes, but then part of them also wants to stay the same because there's almost like that comfort and being complacent and just like knowing what to expect. So if someone's really depressed and they've been depressed their whole life, they're like, well, this is just what feels normal and like home to me. This is familiar. Or someone's anxious all the time. They're like, well, this is like my status quo. And when I don't feel anxious, it feels off. So our brain is like almost fighting against us during these changes because it knows it has to work harder and it's going to take up more room and capacity to change our mindset, our behaviors, our schedule and routine. So you're going to feel like your brain fighting against you during those times. So I would say, if you're going through any major change, number one is having awareness that it's going to be more challenging for you. So have lots of grace and compassion with yourself. Seek out extra support. So maybe your current treatment plan, if you're in therapy or taking medication, is going to need to be evaluated, right? Like a lot of these moms that are going through postpartum or menopause, perimenopause, like any type of major change, like you might need to talk to your doctor about your medication. You might need to change up your therapy or your frequency. You might need to increase your social support during that time. You might need to come up with more coping mechanisms or self-care to help facilitate that change because it's going to be really hard. And the things that were working before probably won't work the same way moving forward.
Yeah, I think that that's so important. And like you said, it's not going to work the same. It's just
Mm-hmm.
with change, it's like, I think that that's one of the things that we have to be able to accept.
Mm-hmm.
And in this process, like the acceptance of, okay, this is different. Okay, this, one of the things for me that I always got stuck on is like, but I was able to do this before so well. Gosh,
Mm-hmm.
I was so high achieving here, or man, like this was so great, or this was never a problem before, or, now I'm having, instead of like the opposite, like this is a strength now, and these other things are problems, right? So it's just recognizing that sometimes your brain does shift as far as like its ability to function and the capacity and what's working and what's not working in different stages of life. And I love what you're saying about adapting your treatment plan is,
Mm-hmm.
I think, huge. And I can think of examples in my life of like people who have been going through significant changes and felt shame for medication changes that are needed. And I understand. I really do. Like it's frustrating. I'm even it's a very small disruption, but like I have a shoulder injury, and so I can't lift more than 5 pounds right now, and my shoulder is out of line, and we still don't know fully what's going on, and so I'm out of my routines as far as exercise, and I can't do certain things. Like when I work with kids, I can hardly pick up the toddler, and having to figure out how to do it with one arm. Right? It's just like little things like that where I get very frustrated at myself, and I find myself like taking it out on me if I'm not like very cognizant of it, which only adds to more of the challenge. So I love that you're talking about self-compassion and grace because yeah, in the certain before the change, you may have been able to do the thing in this way. You may have been able to navigate this no problem. But
Mm-hmm.
now, because of whatever change it is, it's different. Whether it's difficult or it's just adding on to space and maybe it's making other things in your life difficult,
Mm-hmm.
it's recognizing that it's going to be different and there has to be an acceptance piece of that. And as someone who is a control freak and likes to try and control my environment around me and the way the world works, because like, hello, wouldn't that be lovely if we just knew everything that's happening? But it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way because that's just not life. So we just really have to be able to accept, and once you're able to accept and have that awareness, then you can get. I think that's just
Mm-hmm.
wonderful.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you have anything else to share as far as like changes or role shifts or any examples that you want to highlight?
Yeah, and one thing that I like to talk a lot about, especially with females and kind of our connection between like our hormones and ADHD, I don't think people really understand that. So females are with ADHD are a lot more likely to have PMDD, so premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And we're also a lot more sensitive to like the monthly changes, as far as our cycle, postpartum, perimenopause, and menopause, because dopamine and estrogen are actually really connected. And so when we have that drop in estrogen, that also impacts our ability to process dopamine. And so that's where a lot of ADHDers are kind of going along their way. And all of a sudden they go through like the perinatal process and postpartum. And they're like, what's happening to me? Or, perimenopause or menopause, because those are all huge drops in our estrogen. And so that's something that I have to kind of educate a lot of women about, because there is such a strong connection there. So, anyone that's maybe going through some of those milestones in your life, talk to your OBGYN, talk to your PCP, and get some support and help, because those changes are going to change your symptoms and the way that you cope. And you might need some extra assistance and treatment during that time.
Yeah, and I'm even thinking about people who are on birth control and how
Yeah.
that can impact things, right? And that impacts your cycle, right? And like, I've had periods where I haven't really had much of a cycle because of certain birth control, and how that even impacted me, not just physically, but cognitively as well, and not being able to recognize all of those things. So yeah, I think that's a huge, huge thing that plays into that. And especially because so many of the women are the ones who are not being diagnosed till later, you're gonna
Mm-hmm.
be like, oh well, here I am, and again, just internalizing things that it's my fault, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
okay, Amy. Well, thank you so much for this fabulous conversation. Can you share with the audience a little bit more about where to find you, what you do, if you have anything going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida, and I do all virtual and telehealth therapy. So anyone that lives in the state of Florida can access my services. You can just reach out through my website. It's amyteumercounseling.com. I do specialize in adult ADHD and late diagnosis ADHD. And like I said, I also hold a certification in perinatal mental health. So I do a lot of work with women kind of going through fertility challenges, pregnancy, postpartum, transitioning to motherhood and parenthood, and all of that. And then I also offer a lot of different coaching packages as well. So all of that is listed on my website. And then my Instagram is just at Amy Teumer.
Perfect. Well, thank you so, so much for joining us. And definitely, anyone, if you're navigating any of those role shifts, you have ADHD, her page is also very fun and just gives some great information. So definitely go check out all of that stuff again. Thank you so much, Amy, for your time. And I hope as whatever day feels right to have.
Well, thank you so much for having me.